Hello, Social Studies 10. Today we're going to go to the other side of the world and learn about World War II in Asia and the Pacific. Here you have the flag of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was one of the main belligerents in this conflict. And it's often seen as a flag akin to something like the Nazi or the Soviet flag. So what caused this part of the war? So the Japanese felt they needed an empire. At this time in history, although it was starting to fade by the post-World War I world, the prestige of a country was measured by the size of its empire. And the Japanese wanted to show the European countries that they were not inferior and that they could have an empire akin to the European empires, like the French and the British empires. Japan needed raw materials for its industry. Japan was not a resource-rich country, and they didn't have sufficient amounts of materials such as coal, iron, rubber, and oil, as well as other metals like nickel, um, tin, and the need for a market. So Japan was producing lots of things, but they wanted to sell beyond their borders. So in an empire, they could sell the people of their empire the products that their industries created, therefore making more money for their businesses. So as we learned previously, Japan conquered Manchuria, the northeastern part of present-day China, in 1931. Um, and in 1937, they invaded the rest of China. So this is the start of what we call, or we called at that time, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Um, or the Japanese call it the China Incident. Um, so this started at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where a Japanese soldier allegedly went missing, and the Japanese asked the Chinese if they could go look for him, and the Chinese gave them only limited permission, and the Japanese insisted on going into the Chinese side and searching farther, and the Chinese said no, so the Japanese invaded, something like that. So the Chinese military was no match for Japan. Although they had many people, the training was not very good, the technology was not as up to date, and the tactics were not as developed as Japan's. So Japan spread very quickly across northern China, which is mostly flat. And by the end of 1937, most of northern China and eastern China was captured by Japan. Here is the flag of China at the time. This is actually the party flag of the Kuomintang. Chinese national flags don't usually exist. Usually it's the flag of the ruling party. Now, Taiwan uses this flag because the Kuomintang fled China after the war and moved to Taiwan. So here is the president of China at the time, Chiang Kai-shek. And the pink is Japanese conquest of China up to 1938. So we can see they conquered a large swath of the country. This is the most populous part of the country and most of the more wealthy areas as well. Interior China is quite mountainous and hard to travel, and the infrastructure was very poor at that time. One thing I have to say about China, although Chiang was the president, it was very divided. It wasn't a unified country. Um, Chiang controlled mostly the eastern parts of China. Part of the northwest was controlled by communists. Other farther into the west was controlled by different Muslim warlords. Tibet was independent at the time, and Yunnan and Guangxi down here were controlled by warlords allied to him. So, the Rape of Nanking. In 1937, the Japanese captured the Chinese capital, which at the time was Nanjing, or said at the time Nanking. This was near Shanghai. The Japanese thought that the nationalist government, also known as the Kuomintang or the KMT, of Chiang Kai-shek would surrender when their capital was captured. But Chiang refused to surrender. So the Japanese decided that they could force a peace agreement on China by creating massive carnage in the city. So its soldiers were allowed to go on to mutilate and murder between 100 and 300,000 people. Um, and I think most Western historians figures are around 100 to 100,000, 150,000, whereas the Chinese government is figure is 300,000. But that includes over the entire period of the war. So this incident had the opposite effect on the Chinese war effort. It strengthened the Chinese will to fight and made people more determined to resist Japanese expansion in China. So here's some. I went to the memorial many times actually when I was in China. It wasn't very far from where I lived. This is kind of a statue of peace. Heping is peace in Chinese. This is the Japanese version of the events from the um, Japanese War Museum in Tokyo at the Yakushuni Shrine. So this one says, after the Japanese surrounded Nanking in December 1937, General Matsui Iwane distributed maps to his men with foreign settlements and the safety zone marked in red ink. Matsui told them that they were to maintain strict discipline and that anyone committing unlawful acts would be severely punished. The defeated Chinese rushed to Shaguan and were completely destroyed. The Chinese soldiers disguised in civilian clothes were severely prosecuted. So we can see a kind of very ahistorical or propagandistic tilt to that. There are recorded incidents of Japanese officers seeing who could behead 100 people the fastest and things like that. So it was an extremely brutal incident in the history of warfare. So continuing Japanese expansion. So in 1st of September 1939, Japan controlled all the red on this map, and they were looking to continue expanding either into the Soviet Union, so north, or into Southeast Asia to the south. And even though they were getting bogged down in China. So once they started expanding into Western China, the Japanese soon reached the end of their logistics lines, and Chinese defensive resolve strengthened, and the terrain became very difficult to overcome as well. So they started to look either at invading the Soviet Union or going to Southeast Asia. Japan was given Indochina, so what's now Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, by Germany after the French surrender in 1940. The Americans didn't like this. They were keeping a very close eye on Japanese expansionism, and they cut off oil supply to Japan, which was essential for the Japanese military's war effort, because the US supplied 80% of Japan's oil. So the official reason was to dissuade Japan's aggression, because maybe they would make peace with China and leave Indochina. However, this made Japan more desperate because they had now a certain finite reserve of oil before they would run out. So the first target was actually the Soviet Union. Japan fought several border wars here and on the border with Mongolia, which was a Soviet satellite state. However, in the end, the Soviets won a resounding victory. General Zhukov was part of that. And so the Japanese decided that that wouldn't work and signed a non aggression pact with the Soviet Union right on the eve of the Battle of Moscow, when that could have made a big difference. They decided to go for the Southern strategy. To do that, they would have to take out the one effective power in the region, which is the United States. Britain was very busy defending North Africa and its home islands, and the Netherlands, controller of what's now Indonesia, was had been defeated in Europe, and they had very few soldiers to resist Japanese expansion. As I said, Indochina had already been occupied, so the U.S. controlled the Philippines at the time. So, um, the Japanese thought they would have to take out the American Navy. And so to do this, they launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. So here's Hawaii. Way over here, the Americans thought there was no way the Japanese could ever get them in Hawaii. Um, the surprise attack was extremely successful on December 7th, 1941. 7 out of 8 American battleships were either sunk or disabled, and the Americans lost over 200 planes. However, the 3 American aircraft carriers were out to sea on a training mission that day, and that became um, a critical thing in the war. And very stupidly, uh, Hitler reacted to this attack by declaring war on the U.S., even though he didn't have to as part of its Axis agreement. Um, this is seen as one of Hitler's other great mistakes in the war. Italy also declared war on the U.S. So the US was now officially part of the Allies, and this became a critical turning point as the American industrial capacity was the greatest in the world by a lot, and they could now become the arsenal of democracy. So the US was temporarily incapacitated, and in any case, they had an extremely small army, which was not effective at this time. So on December 8th, the Japanese went on basically their own blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia. It's really quite amazing the amount of places they attacked in one day. So they attacked Hong Kong here. They attacked Burma, which was British. Malaya, which is also British. Um, Thailand, which quickly flipped and joined the Axis. They attacked the Philippines, and later they would attack the Dutch East Indies. So, the Battle of Hong Kong. This is one that concerns us for this course because Canadian soldiers were active in this. This was the only major part of the Pacific War that Canadian soldiers played a large direct role in. So, Britain had asked Canada to send troops to Hong Kong in 1940 to defend their small colony. This is more of um, a not a real strategic move, but a gesture that they had to defend all parts of the empire. So Canada sent almost 2,000 troops. India also had quite a few troops there. Japan invaded Hong Kong on December 8th, and they quickly broke through British defenses. The British strategy was to defend the entire island. However, those who defend all defend none, and their defenses were too stretched. So on Christmas Day, 1941, the island officially surrendered, and the Japanese celebrated by attacking the the hospital where they raped the Canadian nurses and bayoneted the wounded. Nearly half of all the Canadian deaths in this part of the conflict were in prisoner of war camps, whereas the death rate of Canadian prisoners of war captured by Germany was about 4%. This I know this was a large issue for my grandfather. He'd had one of his best friends captured, and I think his friend was 80 pounds or something when he was released at the end of the war. Um, so, the Empire of the Rising Sun. By mid 1942, Japan controlled a massive area, 6,000 square miles. Technically, it was larger than the amount of area that Germany had captured, although much of this was ocean. So, they had created a defensive boundary all the way across the Pacific almost to Midway Islands. So this was Japan's strategy, was to create this large defensive zone, and they would basically fortify these small islands all around the Pacific and make it really hard for a counterattack so that the foreign powers would then agree to accept the Japanese empire as it was in this state. So what's happening in China now? This picture is from the Flying Tigers Museum in Kunming, China. So the Chinese front stalemated. The Japanese could win any battle they focused on, but they couldn't win battles all across the front. So they could make one push, but then they would lose ground in other places. Um, and the Chinese managed to fend the Japanese push at the Battle of Wuhan, causing large Japanese losses, which meant that Japan no longer had the strength to continue pushing in. The Americans and other allies sent fighter groups to support the Kuomintang. Uh, the Flying Tigers were the most famous, and they bombed Japanese soldiers and ships at a time when the Japanese were not expecting any sort of opposition in the air against them. The Kuomintang, so the Chinese gave their best soldiers to the Allies to help fight the Japanese in Burma and Yunnan. So let's get the map. They sent their soldiers instead of fighting here mostly to the British to fight here. That was the cost of getting supplies and support from their allies. In northern China, the communists and Japanese did not do much fighting. Eventually, Stalin lost his patience with this and demanded that Mao launch an offensive, so this became the 200 Regiments Offensive. As a response, Japan launched a Three Alls campaign, which was kill all, burn all, loot all, I believe, and this led to a campaign of massive destruction in northern China. And I think at least 3 million people were killed as a result of this campaign. Probably more. This is what the museum in Kunming said about the Flying Tigers. I'm just going to forward through that. It's a very good museum of friendship. So, what's happening in Southeast Asia? So, despite being outnumbered 2-1, Japan managed to make its way down the Malayan Peninsula and capture the undefeatable Gibraltar of the East, Singapore. And this was a huge blow for the British Empire. Churchill saying it was one of the darkest days of his political career. And Japan also made headway in Burma. It's very difficult conditions. A lot of this is jungle and mountains. Many people died of disease such as malaria, dengue fever. The Japanese were stopped right on the Indian border at Imphal and slowly were pushed back through Burma. Allied prisoners of war were used as slaves to build supply lines, railroads for the Japanese. Tens of thousands died, at least. So, racial warfare. Like on the Eastern Front, the war in Asia and the Pacific had a distinct racist tone to it. Um, so on both sides. So first off, we'll look at the Japanese. So the Japanese believed that they were racial superior to other Asians and to other races in general, uh, and therefore they treated them poorly. Um, so this is part of the reason why they were very indiscriminate in killing Chinese civilians. The Japanese used Koreans, Chinese, Taiwanese, and other women as comfort women, basically as forced prostitutes. However, um, when they came across a large Jewish population in Shanghai that were refugees from Germany, they treated them no worse than any other person with a German passport. Actually, at one point, the Nazis sent an officer to Shanghai to request that the Japanese uh, liquidate the Jewish people from Shanghai, and the Japanese officer said, "No, why would I? They have German passports." Um, so obviously they weren't party to what the Nazis were doing in Europe. Um, so that there are also cultural differences. For example, the Japanese saw surrender as worse than death, and therefore, when Allied prisoners surrendered, they were treated very poorly because over thousands of years in Europe, surrender had developed as a suitable option to pointless killing. So Allied prisoners of war were meant to do slave labor until they died. At the end of the war, only 45 Chinese prisoners remained alive, for example. Um, One reason why the Japanese were so effective against the British and American armies initially was because the British and American intelligence, even though they knew that Japan had advanced tactics, modern machinery, and a 20th century war machine, mid 20th century war machine, they refused to acknowledge that the Japanese could actually be a threat to them because the Japanese were not white and therefore could not fight at the same level that the British and Americans could, which turned out to be a big fallacy, as evidenced by the catastrophic defeats early in the war. So back in Allied countries, racism was directed back at the Japanese and at the Japanese living in those countries. So Japanese were made to seem like little men or monkey-like people. Japanese, Canadians, and Americans, as well as in Central and South America, uh, were put in camps, internment camps, or concentration camps, depending on the countries. Despite there being no evidence of any of these people collaborating with Japan or the Japanese military. In Canada's case, they had their homes taken away from them and sold at very low value, along with all their possessions that they didn't have in two suitcases. Um, and this was a huge abuse of the Canadian Constitutional Authority. We're going to look at this in more detail in the next unit. So here's an example of kind of Allied racist propaganda. Here's some more um, racist propaganda. So we could see some of it's meant to manipulate American workers, basically telling them they need to work hard and not take days off at the benefit of, in this case, Texaco. It's an oil company. So finally, in mid 1942, the Americans had reorganized. The big turning point was a battle at Midway, where the U.S. sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The Americans' um, industrial might was much greater than Japan's, So the loss of an aircraft carrier, which would take well over a year, possibly many years to build, was huge for Japan. Aircraft carriers were the way to project power far into the ocean. So slowly the Americans jumped important island to important island, all the way back towards Japan. Japan fought the last man almost on a lot of these islands, causing massive American casualties. Very unacceptable casualties for the Americans. The Americans said, why don't they just surrender? There's no way to win on these battles. Um, so Okinawa and Iwo Jima are two of the more famous islands. Japanese civilians were told to kill themselves rather than allow Americans to conquer their island. So it's very famous cases on Okinawa and Saipan. Um, in some places that were Americans were reconquering, such as the Philippines, the Japanese would attack the local civilians as they were retreating, causing massive loss of life, especially in Philippines and China. And as they were losing their naval power, Japan resorted more and more to kamikaze attacks. This is loading a plane full of bombs and flying it into American boats. Uh, Finally, by the spring of 1945, the US was close enough that they could bomb the Japanese home islands. This caused large destruction. One firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100,000 people, which is actually more than the nuclear bombs killed. Um, but the US didn't want to invade the Japanese home islands. They calculated probably about 4 million people would die, including a million American soldiers. Um, so they were content with strategic bombing at this time. However, it was clear that Japan would not surrender. Japan made it clear that they would not surrender. So the US discussed possibilities of what to do to win the war. Would they just keep bombing? Would they blockade and starve Japan? Or would they have to invade? So we'll look at that in a later PowerPoint. So this is some of the casualty lists for the World War II in Asia and the Pacific. So China, we have probably more than 20 million killed. The statistics aren't that clear. Britain, 52,000 killed. India, fighting as a British colony, at least 86,000 killed. The US, over 100,000 killed. Philippines, which fought as an American colony, 57,000 killed. Australia, 17,000. Soviet Union, 12,000. Japan, uh, about 2 million, more than 2 million total. Thank you.